Hello there, I'm Toby Haydock, and it was possible to eliminate evil from the minds of man for all time. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme about setting forth on a globe-trotting adventure, no matter if you really want to or not. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time or you know your Arbitans from your Zabi plans, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, it's an episode which launches Doctor Who's very first quest narrative as the time travellers embark on a journey around the planet Marinus in search of some missing microcircuitry. So join me, Toby Haydock, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, the Sea of Death. Or, on second thoughts, maybe Marinus isn't the best place for a beach holiday. First broadcast on the 11th of April 1964 at 5:32 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman, with guest star George Coulouris as Arbitan. It was written by Terry Nation, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Gorrie. It was watched by 9.9 million people, and the audience appreciation was 62. The planet Marinus was once a utopia thanks to the mental influence of a great computer called the Conscience. Then Yartek and his Vord followers became immune to the Conscience. To keep Yartek from perverting the machine, 5 critical keys were removed and hidden across Marinus. Now the scientist Arbitan has found a way to make the Vord susceptible to the Conscience once again, but although he has sent his followers in search of the keys, none have returned. When the TARDIS materialises on the island where the Conscience is housed, Arbitan is determined to recruit the Doctor, Ian, Barbara and Susan to help him, willingly or otherwise. Meanwhile, the Vord have found a way to penetrate the sea of acid which encircles the island. The When. 2nd of September 1963. Having been invited to contribute ideas for Doctor Who in July 1963, Malcolm Hulke submits proposals for an historical adventure called Britain 408 AD, about the departure of the Romans from Great Britain during the 5th century, and The Hidden Planet, which is set on a planet which serves as a distorted mirror of modern-day Earth. Hulke is initially asked to develop Britain 408 AD. 23rd of December 1963. The production team has concluded that Doctor Who's opening season requires more science fiction stories rather than those set in Earth's history, so Malcolm Hulke is asked to stop working on Britain 408 AD and instead turn his attention to The Hidden Planet. 24th of September 1963. On the strength of his scripts for the Daleks, Terry Nation is commissioned to write a second Doctor Who story. But this is not another science fiction adventure, it's an historical excursion called The Red Fort. This 7-part serial is set amidst the Indian Mutiny of 1857, when Indian troops rose up against the colonial officers of the British East India Company, and which involved an assault on the Mughal palace in Delhi, known as the Red Fort. Nation's continued involvement in Doctor Who is somewhat surprising, because he's not particularly enjoyed writing the Daleks. And perhaps for this very reason, Nation apparently performs no work whatsoever on the Red Fort. 22nd of October 1963. At around this date, both The Hidden Planet and the Red Fort appear in an outline for the season prepared by story editor David Whittaker, which extends beyond the first 3 planned stories: Anthony Coburn's An Unearthly Child, Nation's The Daleks, and John Lucarotti's A Journey to Cathay, later known as Marco Polo. Story 4 is a minuscule story by Robert Gould. Story 5 is Coburn's The Masters of Luxor. Story 6 is The Hidden Planet. Story 7 is a 7-part serial with an unspecified historical setting to be provided by Whittaker himself, and Story 8 is The Red Fort. 1st of November 1963. The season's transmission schedule shifts slightly to accommodate the addition of the two-part The Edge of Destruction, aka Inside the Spaceship, but not round here, by story editor David Whittaker, which will now be Story 3, inserted between The Daleks and A Journey to Cathay. The Hidden Planet is now Story 7, while The Red Fort becomes Story 9. Before long, however, The Hidden Planet moves up to 5th spot when it becomes clear that neither Gould's scripts nor The Masters of Luxor will be ready in time for production. 2nd of December 1963. Malcolm Hulke is commissioned to write the 6 scripts for The Hidden Planet. 16th of December 1963. This is Terry Nation's delivery date for The Red Fort. By his own admission, however, Nation has put all thought of Doctor Who and of his second commission for the programme out of his head. 21st of December 1963. The Dead Planet, the first episode of The Daleks, is broadcast. Somewhere in Hampstead, it dawns on Terry Nation why he's been having this nagging sense that he's forgotten to do something. January 1964. Malcolm Hulke delivers a script for The Hidden Planet Episode 1. It is not what the Doctor Who production team was looking for, and it quickly becomes clear that The Hidden Planet can't be relied upon as Story 5. The problem is, it's due into studio in mid-March, which means that design work will have to start in a matter of just a few weeks. Suitable scripts are needed, and with the utmost urgency. 21st of January 1964. The first 5 episodes of The Daleks have now aired. Doctor Who has gained 3 million viewers over that span, bringing its total audience to nearly 10 million. In light of this success, Terry Nation meets with David Whittaker, producer Verity Lambert, and associate producer Mervyn Pinfield. Nation is asked to cease work on The Red Fort, not that he ever seems to have started, and instead write a 6-part science fiction adventure which can take the place of The Hidden Planet. Since Nation will need to deliver his scripts within a month, Whittaker offers to work closely with him to develop the narrative. It's quickly agreed that the story will consist of 4 short scenarios, each one introduced and resolved within a single episode, while the opening and closing instalments will tie everything together. It's felt that this approach will be easier for Nation to write in such a brief span of time. Nation quickly assembles a storyline under the title The Keys of Marinus. However, its 4 pages are limited to a background and a description of the first episode, The Sea of Death. At this stage, the conscience of Marinus not only eradicated evil thoughts from the people of Marinus, referred to as Marinians, but also made them vulnerable, for they had no will or desire to resist attack. Thus, the planet was invaded by the Vord, and the Marinians offered no resistance. Indeed, they encouraged their brutal visitors. The Vord of the storyline are totally alien. They have only white corpuscles in their blood, for example. And this is given as the reason for their ability to resist the conscience's influence. The scientists who invented the conscience were also immune to its effects, which is why they had the wherewithal to deactivate it by removing its keys. The Marinians could then retaliate against the Vord, leading to a war that has lasted for centuries, and which the Vord are now beginning to lose. Arbitan, whose name is meant to evoke the word arbiter, is described as the last of the great scientists. He has discovered that the Vord are now susceptible to the conscience because intermarriage and constant exposure to the climate and conditions of Marinus have made the Vord somewhat akin to the Marinians. Arbitan has transported the conscience to the island setting of the first episode, and it is he who has surrounded it with a sea of sulphuric acid. Arbitan possesses one of the 5 keys, not because he had always kept it with him, but because one of his followers was successful in retrieving it. In addition to their goal of taking control of the conscience, the Vord have also come to the island to learn the secret of immunity, known only to Arbitan. When Arbitan forces the time travellers to help him find the 4 remaining keys, he sends them to the location of the first key using a cabinet called a molecular reconstructor. Barbara goes first, followed by the others. Arbitan is left alone, sitting on a carved stool made of fused quartz, when he is stabbed in the back by the sole survivor of the Vord raiding party. It seems that, at this stage, Nation planned to delay the audience's glimpse of a full Vord. because he describes shots of this Vord's black rubber boots and black rubber gloved hands as he steals the conscience key. Meanwhile, the Doctor, Susan and Ian arrive at their destination, only to find that Barbara has disappeared. The only trace of her is her shoes. 3rd of February 1964. In his London flat, Terry Nation has a meeting with David Whittaker. They focus on the production's most pressing concerns, identifying the roles that will need to be cast, the design requirements, and any material that will benefit from being pre-filmed at the Ealing Television Film Studios, especially for the first 4 episodes. 6th of February 1964. Terry Nation delivers the script for The Sea of Death. It is poorly received by John Gorrie, the staff director assigned to the Keys of Marinus, who hasn't really wanted to work on Doctor Who at all, and certainly not outside of an historical setting. Early March 1964. Several inserts are filmed at Ealing. They include all of the model shots of the island, the pyramid, and the Vord submersibles, which are seen to move using a magnet. A miniature TARDIS appears in the first ever footage of the ship materialising. Up to this point, its landings, amidst prehistoric Earth, in Skaro's petrified forest, or on the plain of Pamir in 13th century China, had always taken place from the perspective of the travellers within the time machine. On this occasion, John Gorrie uses an optical dissolve between 2 pieces of footage to achieve the effect. Also filmed at Ealing is the shot of Susan's shoe dissolving in the acidic tidal pool. Finally, designer Raymond P. Cusick has encouraged John Gorrie to add a shot which will illustrate what happens to Vord 2, the Vord whom Ian stops from assaulting Arbitan, after he falls backwards through the alcove wall. The brief sequence consists of a rubber Vord model dropped from a stepladder down a cardboard tube into a bowl of water. 16th of March 1964. 4 days of rehearsals on The Sea of Death begin at the Territorial Army Drill Hall on Uxbridge Road. Verity Lambert is out of the office this week, but David Whittaker keeps an eye on rehearsals, and he assures Lambert that relations are good between John Gorrie and the cast, with work on the episode proceeding well. The principal guest actor, who will appear only in this single instalment of The Keys of Marinus, is George Coulouris as Arbitan. Coulouris had become well known by virtue of his close association with Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre, including a role in 1941's immortal Citizen Kane, which earned Coulouris a Best Acting Award from the National Board of Review. Amongst Coulouris's extensive list of credits are 2 science fiction serials which share some of Doctor Who's DNA. As regular listeners to Too Much Information are well aware, the BBC head of drama who spearheaded the development of Doctor Who was Sidney Newman. Before he arrived at the BBC, however, Newman was the head of drama at ITV franchise holder ABC. Soon after taking up his post at ABC, Newman, always a champion of science fiction, instigated the production of a 6-part serial called Target Luna, which was written by Eric Pace and Malcolm Hulke, whose first go at Doctor Who has just been abandoned at the same time as The Keys of Marinus springs to life. Target Luna was broadcast in April 1960 and was successful enough to warrant 3 sequels: Pathfinders in Space in September that year, Pathfinders to Mars across 1960-61, and Pathfinders to Venus in March 1961. Coulouris appeared in both Pathfinders to Mars and Pathfinders to Venus, playing duplicitous science writer Harcourt Brown. With his schemes to divert the crew of Moon Rocket 4 to first Mars and then Venus, all to satisfy his scientific curiosity, Harcourt Brown was, in some ways, an early version of the Doctor himself. It's fair to consider Coulouris to be the first big-name guest star hired for Doctor Who, but Alan Wheatley, erstwhile Sheriff of Nottingham and Thal leader, might have something to say about that, and as fame is such a nebulous thing, we'll leave listeners to decide. Coulouris and Wheatley actually worked on stage together in The Man in the Raincoat in 1949. Coulouris received higher billing. Gorrie has also recruited his friends Martin Court and Peter Stenson to appear in The Sea of Death. They will play the Vord in this episode alongside dancer Gordon Wales, but will return throughout The Keys of Marinus in various roles. Court will be the warrior statue in The Screaming Jungle, while Stenson will be one of the ice soldiers in The Snows of Terror, albeit as a late replacement for Court himself. Both will appear in Sentence of Death, Stenson as the second judge, Court in the more prominent role of Aidan, before donning their Vord costumes one more time in the concluding instalment. Stenson and Court meet on this production for the very first time and end up becoming friends for life. 18th of March 1964. Amongst those present on the third day of rehearsals for The Sea of Death is Donald Wilson, the BBC's head of drama serials. Afterwards, he conveys his recommendations for dialogue changes to David Whittaker. 20th of March 1964. The Sea of Death goes before the cameras in Lime Grove Studio D. The day begins at 8:30 a.m. with 2 hours for establishing the sets and lighting. Camera rehearsals take place from 10:30 a.m. to 1 p.m, after which the cast and crew enjoy an hour for lunch. 5 more hours of camera rehearsals span 2 till 7 p.m, with a break for tea around 3:45 p.m. Dinner runs from 7 to 8 p.m, after which the technical lineup and the recording itself are scheduled from 8 p.m. to 9:45 p.m. 23rd of March 1964. Editing for The Sea of Death takes place from 6:30 to 9:30 p.m. As we shall see, part of this work includes incorporating some extensive retakes covering several minutes' worth of material. 9th of April 1964. It's a big press day for the Keys of Marinus. In the Radio Times, a half page is given over to a preview of the new serial, including a photograph of the Doctor, Susan, Ian and Arbitan in front of the conscience of Marinus. The article describes the alien planet as a world which seems to be half a utopia and half an inferno. There is a race of men who believe that everyone should have exactly what he wants whenever he wants it. At the same time, there is a rival race as sinister as the Daleks. This doesn't quite match up with the action on screen, however, and it seems that the utopia described by the author may be a garbled version of the city of Morpheton from the second episode, The Velvet Web. The item goes on to give a brief profile of William Russell, whom it notes is a former Old Vic actor, previously best known for his costume parts in serials like Nicholas Nickleby. It concludes, when not travelling into the future, he lives in a sense in the past, in a 17th century house near London. The fact that Russell, one of the regulars, is commented upon here rather than the episode's prominent guest star, Coulouris, may have something to do with Russell's unhappiness about not appearing on the Radio Times cover when Marco Polo featured, with these column inches now serving as some kind of apology and recompense. The Daily Mail also profiles the Keys of Marinus. Douglas Marlborough's article, headlined "New TV Monsters Will Rival the Daleks," focuses on the Vord, another breed of space fiction weirdies. Marlborough mentions their rubber costumes no fewer than 3 times, whilst also noting that they have the horned hands of king-sized beetles, key-shaped protuberances on their faces, and hands like giant claws. He also quotes Verity Lambert as saying of the Vord,
"They do not appear in every episode. They're only one of many menaces."
Over in the Daily Express, the Vord and their rubber costumes are again the centre of attention, with a photo accompanying an article called "After the Daleks, a New Horror, Vords." We'll come back to the puzzling pluralisation of Vord a little later in this episode. This piece too compares the Vords' heads to enormous beetles, the creepy crawly things, not Ringo and co., and on top of their noses, antennae sprout. All in all, pretty horrible. 11th of April 1964. Photos of Carol Ann Ford as Susan, with Peter Stenson in his Vord costume, crop up in a couple of newspapers. The Mirror's "My word, it's a Vord," sees Susan being carried away by the Vord while she gets her own back in the Daily Mail's "In the grip of a Vord," playfully chomping down on Stenson's rubber-encased arm. Then, at 5:32 p.m, The Sea of Death hits the airwaves, a couple of minutes later than its scheduled start time. It should be mentioned that during episodes of Too Much Information to date, I've perhaps been a little remiss in that I've been reporting the scheduled transmission time for each episode, but not the time that the episodes actually went out. And I know that these are the hard-hitting, earth-shattering, mind-blowing facts that you expect Too Much Information to deliver, so deliver them I shall from this point on. I've even hired a chap to help out with the scripts to avoid colossal failures in judgment like this in the future, or, at the very least, to have someone else I can blame them on. Ha ha. For what it's worth, none of the Doctor Who episodes we've discussed so far have deviated from their intended schedule by more than 3 minutes. That laggard, if you're curious, and I know you are, would be The Rescue, the concluding episode of the Daleks, so I haven't missed out on anything particularly exciting. We'll have to wait until the censorites before a transmission time really goes off the rails. The 9.9 million viewers who watch The Sea of Death represents an audience 500,000 smaller than Assassin at Peking, the final episode of Marco Polo. However, the chart position is exactly the same, 22nd. Furthermore, the audience appreciation score rebounds. Having been mired at 59 for the last 3 weeks, it bounces back up to a healthier 62. The What? As the Doctor Who title sequence fades, we mark the first instance of a story starting without having been foreshadowed in any way by its predecessor. An Unearthly Child ended with the TARDIS detecting the radiation on Skaro that would be a key plot point in the Daleks. The Daleks culminated in the explosion aboard the TARDIS that was the first indication that the time machine is on the edge of destruction. And the edge of destruction wrapped up with Susan discovering a footprint in the snow upon the plain of Pamir, the initial setting of Marco Polo. But Marco Polo concluded with Marco Polo and Kubla Khan speculating about the ship's next destination. Only now do we discover the answer to that question, although Terry Nation's draft script had assumed there would be a reprise from the end of Marco Polo. Its cue for a recap from the previous episode was dropped from the camera script. As we've already discussed, the model shot of the island on Marinus incorporates the landmark first TARDIS materialisation. Note that the miniature TARDIS still boasts the St. John's ambulance badge on the police box door, but, as we'll see in a few minutes, when the travellers leave the time machine, it's already been painted over on the full-size prop. There is one connection between Marco Polo and the Keys of Marinus. Ian is still wearing the jacket he acquired during the latter stages of the previous story. His opening line of dialogue, asking the Doctor about the presence of radiation, is the first, but certainly not the last, example in Doctor Who of Terry Nation's proclivity for referring back to his own earlier scripts. A stage direction deleted from the camera script indicated that the Doctor should join Ian and Barbara at the scanner screen rather than having all 4 TARDIS travellers gathered around the console. Likely this action was omitted because a bare-bones TARDIS set has been assembled with little room for the time travellers to move anywhere except towards the door. The Doctor and Susan's exchange about the old man equipping his ship with colour television was considerably longer and, in its own way, far more remarkable in the camera script. The Doctor was to explain that, "I was working on that on your planet. You remember the first time we met. My colour rays aren't mixing. I went along to the British Broadcasting Corporation, but they were infernally secretive." Susan was then to ask,
"Was that the day you came back in such a bad temper, grandfather?"
To which the Doctor responded, "I never lose my temper." Almost 60 years on, it's difficult to say whether this exchange would have been gloriously metatextual or risibly self-reverential. Certainly, though, it demonstrates an awareness that the Doctor's personality has already evolved away from the hostile paranoia that characterised his initial appearance in An Unearthly Child, with a suggestion that, in fact, this gruffness was never meant to be indicative of his usual temperament. What we nearly had there, then, was Doctor Who's very first retcon. In the script, the image of the TARDIS scanner was to be a photo caption, but instead we have a live feed from the beach set, as captured by camera 4. While this does provide a shot of the sea and beach, as Terry Nation had requested, we can reasonably infer that what he had in mind was a wider perspective looking out onto the water, rather than a view encompassing just a few feet beyond the shoreline. As a result, Ian's sighting of something on the scanner screen, presumably meant to be a glimpse of the Vord's glass submersibles, seems pretty unlikely. The Doctor stumbles over his reply to Susan's request to leave the TARDIS. The Doctor is meant to say, Yes, I don't see why not. There doesn't seem to be any danger." But Hartnell loses his way early on, instead offering, "Yes, I don't think so. I don't see why not. There's nothing, no danger about. Come on, let's go." This pirouetting around the intent of the line then appears to throw William Russell off his. Ian's "no, well," is meant to agree with the doctor's assessment that there's no danger, before he reconsiders with his comment about seeing something move on the scanner. Instead, it seems like Ian is telling the doctor and Susan not to go. The doctor's rather baffled "what" is also unscripted, leaving Russell to pull his comments back to their original aim. In doing so, Ian comes across as somewhat less certain about the motion on the scanner. In the script, he definitively dismisses it as just a shadow, but on screen, it's possibly just a shadow. After this opening TARDIS scene, there's an early camera break, allowing both the cast and the operators of cameras 1 and 2 to move to the beach set, where camera 3 and 4 are already waiting. The order in which the travellers leave the TARDIS differs between the camera script and the actual performance. Terry Nation specifies that they're led by Ian, then Susan follows, and only after her line about the beauty of the sea do Barbara and Doctor Who emerge. Instead, Susan takes the pole position, with the Doctor, Ian and Barbara all filing out immediately behind her. William Hartnell's infamous fluffed line about the sea not being frozen, "No, impossible at this temperature, besides, it's too warm," was scripted as, No, not at this temperature, impossible, it's quite warm." So, to be fair to Hartnell, as unintentionally funny as the goof may seem, it's really just the errant interjection of "besides" that makes a nonsense of it. As the time travellers move along the beach, we get our first, albeit only partial, shot of a Vord. This is Vord 1, according to the script. Designed by Daphne Dare, the costumes each consist of a wetsuit, which is paired with a helmet and gloves fabricated from vulcanised rubber by Jack and John Lovell, who are based in Battersea. The Lovells work to a quote of less than £70, about £1,800 in today's money. Now, the surviving documentation indicates that the Lovells were asked to make 3 Vord helmets and 3 pairs of gloves, and this is going to be a significant digit later in this episode, so stay tuned. When the Doctor approaches Ian and Barbara with the chunk of glass, the script suggests that he should instead be holding a handful of pebbles that each look like lumps of glass, so presumably several smaller pieces of glass rather than a single big piece. A lengthy exchange is dropped on recording after the Doctor confirms Ian's deduction that what he is holding is glass.
"I nearly had heart failure,"
exclaims Barbara.
"I thought you were going to tell us they were diamonds."
The Doctor replies, "Oh, yes, of course. Diamonds are precious stones on your Earth, aren't they?"
"Very,"
Barbara confirms. The Doctor continues, "But what we have here is glass, and the odd thing is, it seems to run right under the sea, unless my eyes deceive me." "We'll have to be careful," says Ian. "It looks sharp enough to cut through our shoes." Perhaps the first part of the exchange is dropped because the value of diamonds would seem less relevant to Doctor Who's juvenile target audience, while the second part will shortly be undermined by the fact that Ian is about to spend quite a bit of time walking around the beach in his stockinged feet. The following action, from Susan getting ready to paddle in the tidal pool up until her return to the TARDIS, is a retake. Most of it is re-recorded at the end of the studio session. However, the shot of the Vord at the TARDIS and Susan entering the time machine are performed for a second time before the cast and crew proceed to the subsequent scene in which the Doctor remonstrates with Ian for not wearing shoes. As a result, a planned recording break in the vicinity of this material is rendered unnecessary. The description of how Barbara comes to knock Susan's shoe into the acid pool is different in the script. It has Susan sitting, not standing, next to the pool. She removes her second shoe and puts it beside the first on a rock that slopes down into the pool. Barbara sits down next to her and, with her hand, she accidentally touches a shoe. It tumbles into the water. Barbara's stumble gets to the point rather more expediently. Susan's seated position in the script provides Terry Nation with the opportunity to further heighten the drama of her attempt to paddle in the acid pool. She swings her feet over the pool, stage directions tell us, so that when Ian cries out, her feet are just a fraction above the water. In the script, Ian lends Susan his shoes, but all of the relevant dialogue is amended to boots to reflect the actual outfit that William Russell is wearing. Susan's quip about filling the boots with sand and her description of them as 7-league boots plus Ian's remark about Susan getting lovely corns, are all ad-libs. In the script, Susan and the schoolteachers just laugh as she tries on his footwear. In the shot of the TARDIS door that follows, the script indicates that it should be partly opened, which it certainly doesn't appear to be on screen. The Vord is meant to start to push the door further ajar when he hears Susan approaching, whereas the finished episode instead has him caressing the lock as if he's never seen one before, or maybe because it reminds him of the keys that are going to be essential to the Vord domination of Marinus. By the way, we get our first, albeit only partial, description of a Vord here. A hand and arm cased in black rubber, the fingers webbed. Terry Nation is specific about not yet wanting to reveal the full Vord shape. Another beloved William Hartnell gaffe follows in the next scene. The Doctor is scripted to say to Ian, "Pity you weren't wearing shoes, young man. You can have lent her yours." Instead, he muddles through the immortal, "Yes, and if you'd had your shoes on, my boy, you could have lent her hers." John Gorrie has suggested that he very nearly stopped the recording for a retake of this line, but let's be honest, we're all very grateful that he decided not to, aren't we? During this exchange, the Doctor, Ian and Barbara are meant to be rounding a rock formation, and only then do they spy the Vord's glass submersibles. This staging makes rather more sense than the Doctor spotting them simply by turning around, which means that they must have been in the schoolteacher's line of sight the whole time. The submersibles are constructed by Shawcraft, the same Uxbridge-based firm responsible for the Dalek casings, and were chiefly made from perspex. Terry Nation's script describes them as 3 transparent tubes, each about 6 feet long and wide enough for a man to lie inside. The noses of the tubes are bullet-shaped and opaque. At the tails are stabilizing fins. The tubes are empty. The Doctor asking Ian to help me get this top off as he inspects the glass submersible was simply, "Give me a hand to get it open," in the draft script. Barbara was then to ask if she can help. The Doctor would tell her to look out for signs of habitation before turning back to Ian, telling the schoolteacher to be careful. "I think it's dry, but there may still be acid adhering to the outside." Further unrecorded material can be found in the camera script. "There doesn't seem to be any hinge or opening," observes Ian. "Maybe the ends unscrew." "Quite likely, yes. Try it," encourages the Doctor. "Whichever way it works, it would have to be absolutely watertight or acid-tight, absolutely essential." In the programme as broadcast, Barbara just wanders off along the beach while the Doctor and Ian silently work on the submersible. After Susan has emerged from the TARDIS, her crying out for her grandfather is absent from the camera script. It is only now that Terry Nation provides the first description of the Vord's big rubber mask, respirator type, huge glass eyepieces, as sinister as possible. The last sentence is actually longer in the draft script because it refers to stage directions omitted from the camera script. What Terry Nation originally writes is, "As sinister as possible, he looks at Ian's shoes. Then he rubs out his footprints and starts to follow Susan, destroying his prints as he goes." This explains why the Doctor, Ian and Barbara later spot Susan's footprints in the sand, but not the Vord's. We now see that Vord 1 has a circular antenna. The Doctor offering Ian his cane to pull out the dead Vord's rubber suit seems to be a bit of business developed in rehearsals. This unnumbered Vord has a semicircular antenna. When Ian spies the pyramid, his somewhat perplexing reaction in the draft script is, "Look, there's a break in the rocks." Well, that's rather burying the lead, Mr. Chesterton. The line has become, "Look, there's some sort of building," in the camera script, and then William Russell jazzes it up further with his reference to a fantastic building. Terry Nation describes the pyramid as giving the appearance of having been built from great marble blocks. The draft script asks for a pan along the wall to give the impression of considerable length, but this is gone from the camera script, presumably because of the decision to convey the building's enormity using a painted black cloth. There's also a suggestion of more cutting between angles in the draft script, rather than the single continuous shot that the sequence becomes. The Vord who stalks Susan is meant to have drawn a long knife from his belt, although this doesn't quite match up with the small blade he wields on screen. When the Vord topples through the rotating door into the pyramid, we get our first, but unfortunately not our last, glimpse of the stagehand who actually operates the mechanism, standing inside the door to the left. The arrival of the Doctor, Ian and Barbara at the mysterious building provides an opportunity for this mostly adventure-oriented script to at least squeeze in a few seconds of educational content. Barbara's comment about the building techniques of not only the Egyptians but also the Indians of Central and South America additionally manages to foreshadow her extensive knowledge of the culture that will feature prominently in the very next story, the Aztecs. When the three time travellers split up, the Doctor's essentially redundant indication that the furthermost point is probably around the corner there somewhere is a slight mangling of the scripted line, in which he was supposed to suggest that they meet at the furthermost corner. The geography at the pyramid's exterior is a little disorientating, given that the same set and backcloth are used regardless of the corner on which the action is taking place. Matters become particularly confused when William Russell comes onto the set a bit too early, just after the Doctor disappears through the rotating wall. To the viewer, it seems as if Ian and Barbara are running past the secret door, but in fact they're meant to be running along a different part of the building altogether, round the corner. The interior of the pyramid is meant to be eerie, echoing, dank and dripping, according to the script. As we will discover, the hooded monk who appears behind Susan is Arbitan, but in this material he is not played by George Coulouris. Instead, he's doubled by extra John Beerbohm, who will later return to Doctor Who as a denizen of Paris in War of God, the first episode of The Massacre. How Vord 1 winds up with a knife in his back isn't very clear on screen, and the script doesn't really improve the situation. After he lunges for Susan, Terry Nation writes that the Vord takes one step, then with a groan slumps forward and falls to the floor. In his own back is his own dagger. The implication seems to be that Arbitan has used a concealed access on the other side of the wall to pilfer the Vord's knife and stab him, but the staging leaves a lot of heavy lifting to the audience's imagination. In part, this is because the knife has been attached to the Vord costume throughout the scene, so actor Martin Court has had to be careful to keep facing the camera throughout. Similarly, it's not clear how Ian evades capture when he finds the entrance to the pyramid, given that Arbitan is standing on the other side of the pivoting door just a few seconds later to nab Barbara. Stranger still, according to the camera script, Ian's next scene is supposed to start with him in one of the alcoves, examining the wall to discover how it opens, which would seem to imply that he hasn't moved at all since gaining access to the building. Did Terry Nation intend for him to find a nearby but different hidden door? At any rate, the on-screen action more sensibly starts the scene with him already wandering down the corridor where he finds the dead Vord, as a member of the crew dives out of the way behind him. In the cell with Barbara and Susan, the Doctor's assertion that Arbitan lives in the building slightly changes the sense of the scripted line, in which he says that Arbitan seems to belong in the building, which seems to be a more sensible deduction. A recording break follows before the scene involving Ian, Arbitan and Vord 2, who has a triangular antenna. Again, the on-screen action is murky as to exactly what happens at its climax. According to the script, after Ian throws the Vord against the wall, Arbitan is meant to twist a carving, which causes the wall to open. As recorded, it seems as if he instead tugs on some sort of concealed lever. The very start of the next shot is cut from the finished episode, as Ian looks down into the pit. This is because the camera has accidentally captured both Arbitans, George Coulouris and John Beerbohm, in frame at the same time, with the guest star in the process of coming on set to replace his double. From the moment we first see him, Coulouris has the hood of his costume pulled down, although the script suggests that he should do this only after Ian asks if he is a prisoner in the pyramid. That's fair enough, though. You probably don't want to hide your expensive guest star from the viewers at home for an instant more than is strictly necessary. In the ensuing discussion between Arbitan and Ian, the scientist uses the word Vord for the first time. As in Terry Nation's storyline, Vord is intended to serve as both the singular and the plural. However, the actors adhere to this only inconsistently, leading to several uses of words later in the episode. It even makes it into the closing credits. Perhaps, like squid or grapefruit, both variants are acceptable on Marinus. When Arbiton offers to take Ian to the cell where his friends are waiting, the Science Master's good idea is a truncated version of the scripted, "I think that might be a good idea, lead the way." We then get our first glimpse of Vord 3, just before a third recording break. Now, Vord 3's antenna is also semicircular, much like the dead Vords. But for the purposes of this podcast, more time than is remotely decent has been spent freeze-framing every single angle that gives us a view of Vord 3's antenna and dead Vord's antenna, and Vord 3's adornment definitely looks thinner than his late counterparts. And Jonathan Morris, in his great Fact of Fiction article in Doctor Who magazine, thinks so too, which is good enough for us. As mentioned earlier, though, John and Jack Lovell were only asked to provide a quote for 3 Vord helmets, so it seems likely that Vord 3's costume is the same as dead Vord's, with Gordon Wales hastily donning it after the scene in which it was retrieved from the glass submersible, but with the antenna swapped out. The similarity of the 2 Vord symbols is probably down to the fact that, with dead Vord's antenna only on screen briefly, there wasn't felt to be a compelling reason to design something altogether distinct. The room containing the conscience of Marinus, or the conscience of the planet, as it's actually dubbed in stage directions, is known in the script as the archive room. It's meant to be lined with shelves, all stacked with documents and books, but designer Raymond Cusick has very limited money to spend, and so it is mostly assembled out of metal and fiberglass scenery stock scavenged from elsewhere, including elements from a light entertainment programme that were essentially pulled out of the skip. The big spend on this set is the conscience itself, which is also constructed by Shawcraft. A vast electronic machine designed with symmetry is how it's described in the script. This symmetry is broken at 4 points where it is obvious that some parts of the machine have been removed. The shattered symmetry isn't obvious on screen, where the conscience is, in fact, a very symmetrical dodecahedron. Maybe planet Marinus isn't located far from planets Tygella and Zulfa-Thura. Speaking of which, it's only at this stage that we learn the name of the world on which the TARDIS has landed. Marinus is a Latin word from mare, or sea, and it is, of course, the provenance of English words like marine and marina. It seems very likely that Terry Nation is directly inspired by the acid sea which surrounds the current episode's island setting, but we'll shortly see from Arbiton's map that the planet's only landmasses are a single continent and 1 small island, so Marinus is indeed very much a water world. When Arbitan is giving the history of Marinus, he was originally to say that Yartek invented an immunizer. He made many of these immunizers for his followers. The on-screen dialogue is more vague, simply indicating that Yartek found a means of overcoming the power of the machine. Likewise, Arbitan was later to say that, "We always hoped that we would overcome Yartek's immunizer," rather than, "We always hoped that we would find a way of modifying it and making it again irresistible." George Coulouris's delivery also stipulates that the Vord are Yartek's followers, implying that Yartek himself is not a Vord, although this distinction is not found in the script. After Arbitan explains that he has been working on the conscience, the Doctor's deduction that it is not only irresistible once more, but also that Arbitan can overcome and control the Vords again is absent from the camera script. The fade to black at the end of the scene in the archive room marks another recording break, providing the series regulars with an opportunity to return to the beach set. At the start of the next scene, stage directions indicate that Ian should sit down as he and Barbara wait for their companions, but William Russell remains standing, probably because the only seats that the set offers all bear an unfortunate resemblance to giant skewers. When Susan catches up with the schoolteachers, a portion of her dialogue has been dropped.
"Sorry we've been so long,"
she was supposed to say.
"The climb was a bit steep for Grandfather."
When the time travellers are inspecting the force field around the TARDIS, the script rather unhelpfully suggests, "We exploit the virtual possibilities of the invisible barrier." So, thanks for working that one out in detail, Mr. Nation. William Russell slightly preempts Jacqueline Hill when he amends Ian's line, "It's some sort of barrier," to "It's some sort of invisible barrier." As scripted, it is Barbara who first uses the term invisible, but it's pretty obvious anyway, so let's cut him some slack. A lengthy exchange is cut after the Doctor's declaration that a force barrier has been thrown up around the ship. Ian was then supposed to say, "A change of molecular structure," presumably in reference to the air around the TARDIS.
Wouldn't that mean an explosion?
Wonders Barbara. It seems that Terry Nation is thinking about the process of nuclear fission, often associated with atomic bombs, because the Doctor's reply, "To achieve this, one doesn't divide the atoms, you subtract them. For about a foot in depth around the ship there is a circular wall from which all atoms have been taken. Do you see?" How this would create a barrier isn't clear, and given that allusions to atomic warfare is territory that Nation has only recently trod in the Daleks, it is presumably decided that this dialogue doesn't actually accomplish very much. Again, the fade to black coincides with a recording break, this time so that the Doctor, Susan, Ian and Barbara can return to the archive room. The map of Marinus, not mentioned in the script, presents us with an interesting conundrum. As noted earlier, it indicates that the only land masses on Marinus are a large continent and a small island. A natural interpretation would be that the island is where the TARDIS has landed, but if so, it's hard to imagine how the acid sea, even if it's a relatively localised phenomenon, wouldn't have had a disastrous effect on the ecology and geography of the entire planet over time, since there would be no way to keep the acid from seeping out into the wider ocean. In Doctor Who magazine, Jonathan Morris instead proposes that the titular Sea of Death is, in fact, an inland sea, located somewhere on the large continent. He points out that, in the opening model shot of the island, a mountain range is clearly visible in the distance, suggesting that the island is much closer to a large landmass than the island on the map. Ultimately, we don't know what was intended, and nor do we know if that intrepid anonymous cartographer of 1964 invested anywhere near the same amount of thought on the mechanics of the acid sea as we have here. We can say with some certainty, however, that that individual would not have been expecting his or her work to be studied and dissected 6 decades later, so, in the spirit of fairness, let's move on. And what we move on to is another hop to the end of a recording session. A second retake, much briefer than the first, covers the archive room material from Arbitan's assurance that the voyage across Marinus won't happen via the primitive submersibles, up to the scientist's demise. Arbitan's direction to Barbara, "Place that around your wrist, please," is presumably business worked out in rehearsal, to better inform the viewer of what she's doing with the device. This is important because, of necessity, Camera 1 doesn't linger on Jacqueline Hill. She's actually darting across the studio to an area of black drapes, for reasons that will become clear momentarily. A short exchange is cut here. In the script, Arbitan says of the teleporting device, "It separates molecular structure and reassembles at one's destination." "In the same order, I hope," quips Ian. But this line is replaced with, "What, this little thing?" on screen. Meanwhile, Jacqueline Hill is now standing in front of camera 4. Barbara's disappearance is achieved via what the script simply describes as some special effect, but is actually inlay. The shot of Hill from camera 4 is initially placed over the right-hand side of camera 1's output, making it seem as if Barbara is still standing next to her friends. And then this superimposition is removed to achieve her abrupt departure. The black drapes behind Hill and the black area of the archive room set help the transition to appear seamless. The opposite effect is then used to make the Doctor, Ian and Susan vanish, with the output of camera 4, now just pointing at the black drapes, overlaid atop William Hartnell, William Russell and Carol Ann Ford. Arbitan's final aspiration is slightly different in the camera script. Rather than wishing the travellers succeed, "For the sake of all my people," the written line is, "For the future of all our people." Also different is the subsequent action. In the draft script, Arbitan then buries his face in his hands. His death at the hands of Vord III was to be more oblique, achieved first by a pan to the door to establish the Vord's presence, then a cutaway of an upraised knife in the Vord's hand, and finally a close-up of Arbitan as he jerks forward and sinks to the floor. The on-screen depiction of the sequence follows the camera script, which greatly simplifies the stage directions just by indicating that he walks to the machine, Vord comes to him and knifes him. The evening's final recording break then occurs. The episode's concluding scene takes place in what we will discover next week is the city of Morphoton. For its part, the script simply indicates that we're looking at impressive double doors. The arrival of the Doctor, Ian and Susan is achieved slightly differently from their departure a minute earlier. This time, John Gorrie crossfades from a photo caption of those impressive double doors to a small set with William Hartnell, William Russell and Carol Ann Ford already in position. William Russell's use of the term travel dial doesn't appear in the script, but it's how the device will be known from this point onwards. The Who. George Coulouris. George Coulouris, playing Arbitan, has the distinction of being the only actor to have appeared in both Doctor Who and Citizen Kane, often described as the greatest movie of all time. He was born to a Greek father, Nicholas, and an English mother, Abigail, née Redfern, in Manchester on the 1st of October, 1903. He grew up in Salford because, as he recalled in 1986, his father was a gutsy little Greek who was not satisfied to starve in a little mountain village in the Peloponnesus, but made a zigzag way which ended him up running the King's Restaurant, Trafford Road. Nicholas had even greater success, making money buying, refurbishing and selling junk from the nearby docks. As well as being put to work helping his father's business, sorting junk, cleaning things, hanging them out to dry, all sorts, young George attended Manchester Grammar School, where he was a bright and cultured student. "I was changed in every way by that school," he recalled, and that included being cast in the school play. He had ambitions to be a journalist, but a meeting with one, orchestrated by Nicholas in order to put him off, with a declaration that it was impossible to make a living as one, had the desired result. George suffered some racial abuse due to his Greek heritage, but "I was deeply and romantically attached to England culturally, spiritually. I learnt the greatness of Shakespeare. His verse drove me wild, so much so that I pranced around the streets of Manchester, howling out parts of Othello." Nicholas, of course, did not approve of his son's theatrical ambitions either. Indeed, he tried to get what George described as all the rich Greeks of Manchester to dissuade him. "They told me that I was insane, that I was going into a profession which was a barrowload of shit, that I would marry a woman that had slept with hundreds of men before, and that I would starve." Instead, Nicholas attempted to set him up with a shop dealing in cotton materials in Athens. This was something of a disaster, and George returned home. The situation there was untenable, and with the help of his sympathetic mother, she had put some money aside and called in all debts owed her to provide him with a financial package, he absconded, leaving a note for his father which read simply, "You forced me to go to London to try and become an actor because you wouldn't hear of it." He headed to the capital. His Lancashire accent didn't endear him to theatrical managers, and his many overtures were largely ignored, but with one last throw of the dice, he managed to gain access to Dame Sybil Thorndyke, who, impressed by his letter, he'd written many, and to everyone, allowed him access to her dressing room during a matinee of St. Joan. She was in full armour, and he, as he put it, bellowed his Shakespeare at her, terrifying her mother, who was also present. Thorndyke graciously suggested that George apply for a scholarship to the Central School of Speech and Drama, where, she said, they had the personnel to iron out his northern dialect. So he travelled. He ended up bluffing his way in French into a job as a waiter on the liner Majestic, frequented by millionaires, and took teaching jobs in Luzerne and then Milan, and was eventually taken in by Central, in 1925. By this time, his father had come around to his ambitions and helped to sponsor his study. "I didn't fit in," George recalled of that time. "The other students thought I was a very, very eccentric character. They were mostly colonels' daughters, and I felt socially inferior." He enjoyed Peggy Ashcroft's company, though, and at one time worked with a young Laurence Olivier. He returned to the family home in Urmston when his mother died in 1926, and it was up north, in the Rusholme district of Manchester, about a mile from where too much information is recorded, that he did his first acting job at Rusholme Repertory, situated in an undertaker's yard, playing a clergyman in the play Outward Bound. His fancy new accent, acquired in London, meant he got a bad review, which only cemented his father's opinion that George shouldn't have become an actor. So it was back to London, and a production of Henry V at the Old Vic, before he went into Sirocco by Noel Coward, which ended up being the biggest flop Coward ever had, with the whole company booed at the curtain call. George was back with the Old Vic Company for their 1926-27 season. He didn't fit in there, and, unhappy with his treatment, demanded more money, which led to him being shown the door. This didn't stop him, though, and it was on to the prestigious Cambridge Festival Theatre, where we had his first major success, playing the Yank in the first UK production of Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape, as well as good parts like Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet and Jaques in As You Like It. He enjoyed another kind of success too, meeting a young American woman painting scenery backstage, Louise Franklin, with whom he fell in love. When she returned home, she persuaded him to join her in New York, and he managed to snag himself membership of American Equity and to get work in the classics on stage. And in 1929, he made his Broadway debut in Bernard Shaw's The Apple Cart. He played Talent in the play The Late Christopher Bean at the Henry Miller Theatre in 1932, which led to it becoming his first film role too, and so he'd cracked Hollywood by 1933, just in time for his father, who died in 1935, to see that George's acting ambitions were perhaps not so ill-conceived after all. In 1936, George met Orson Welles whilst working on the play 10 Million Ghosts, and Coulouris, annoyed by Wells's burgeoning reputation as a genius, spent his time in the dressing room deliberately winding up the precocious talent. The play was a flop. The actors turned up one day to find themselves locked out of the theatre, but later, when Coulouris had seen and admired Wells's Dr. Faustus and told him so, the great man asked George to join his Mercury Theatre, offering him a choice of parts. "It could only have happened in New York," remembered Coulouris of this groundbreaking endeavour. "We burst like a bomb and became famous overnight. A great young organisation full of brains." Coulouris continued to not make it easy for himself, as he'd shown distaste for the wages offered by Welles. "I was in revolt against the legend. It is a role that comes easily to me." However, Welles felt such rebelliousness perfect for the role of Mark Antony in Mercury's 1937 modern dress Julius Caesar, which won huge acclaim. It was not, though, as glamorous as it sounds. "I found myself on a chilly October morning in a coined bootleg brewery on the banks of the Hudson, grappling with friends, Romans, countrymen, surrounded by chunks of falling ceiling." The Mercury Theatre also performed on radio, and so Coulouris found himself as a member of the cast of the very first audio production of Dracula in 1938, starring Welles as the Count and George as Jonathan Harker, just one of many performances he made in the medium. Notably, he also played the title role in the detective serial Bulldog Drummond in the early 1940s. His feisty attitude clearly impressed the maverick Welles, and he went with him to Hollywood and played the hefty part of Walter Parks Thatcher in Citizen Kane in 1941. Once again, the truth was not quite as much fun as the legend might suggest, as he wrote at the time, "The movie is going to be terrible, as Welles is a ham and is in practically every scene. I have been unable to restrain my opinion of him, so have passed it on to all the stupid, idiotic, sheep-like make-up men, cameramen, etc., who regard him as a genius. Oh, this is an irritating place. Why the hell they can't stick to their business of entertaining morons and not gabble about art is beyond me. He was, however, on $1,000 per week, which must have softened any blow. He continued his stage work once Hollywood had beckoned, mounting and starring in his own Broadway production of Richard III in 1943. The critic George Jean Nathan thought he resembled a screen Bela Lugosi crossed with a grand opera Quasimodo, whilst Theatre Arts Monthly's Rosamund Gilder said, "Mr. Coulouris gives a consistently malign performance. He is particularly good at Richard's moments of macabre fun." He secured himself a good agent and targeted his next role, managing to talk his way into a part he coveted, a villainous Romanian count, a blackmailer with Nazi connections, in the Oscar-nominated Watch on the Rhine in 1943, another film part he'd originated on stage. As soon as the film was seen, he never stopped, usually being offered villainous parts. He was a Nazi in disguise in The Master Race, 1944. He enjoyed playing opposite Betty Davis as a psychiatrist in Mrs. Skeffington, also 1944, although he found her hard to get to know. He was a treacherous type in The Western California with Barbara Stanwyck in 1947, the scheming pretend psychiatrist who dupes Claudette Colbert in Sleep, My Love in 1947, and Baudricourt opposite the St. Joan of Ingrid Bergman in Joan of Arc in 1948. He returned to England at the end of the decade. "In Britain they have a magnificent way of ignoring people," he said, and found his homecoming not as easy as he had hoped, with many people in the business unaware of his Hollywood successes. Nevertheless, his return to the British stage happened very quickly, in August 1949 at Edinburgh, in the world premiere of Peter Ustinov's The Man in the Raincoat. Talking of the stage, his Bristol Old Vic Tartuffe in 1950 was judged good enough to transfer to Hammersmith. George Coulouris gives him an unctuous plausibility which seems to have in it something of all the sanctimonious rogues one has met in life or fiction, wrote the Telegraph. His portrayal of the old tutor Ulrich Brendel in Michael McGowan's revival of Ibsen's Romisham that year was also impressive. Later in the decade, he played King Lear in Glasgow and Malvolio and Claudius at Swiss Cottage. And he was well cast as Smiley Coy in Sam Wanamaker's production of Clifford Odets's The Big Knife, and as Detective Hawkshaw in The Ticket of Leave Man at the Arts Theatre, Cambridge. His return to notable film work was facilitated by actor Herbert Lom's refusal to wear rubber makeup for the film Outcast of the Islands, and so Coulouris snagged a screen test and won the approval of its acclaimed director, Carol Reed. The day after he wrapped that, he worked for Ralph Thomas on Appointment with Venus. Despite the title, it was not science fiction, but a Channel Island World War II film with David Niven. This was to be the first of 7 pictures George did for Betty Box Productions. He became a ubiquitous film player, but he felt that British actors from the stage were used too much in films and had not adapted well to movie acting and weren't paying attention to the unique intricacies of the medium as they did in Hollywood. He was due to make his UK TV debut on the 3rd of December 1950 in a production of Enemy of the People, but dropped out due to a film offer, and Andre Morel replaced him as Dr. Stockman. It was a debut deferred, though, and he finally hit the small screen in Britain in 1951. But despite appearing in a number of TV plays, which at the time would have been more illustrious, it was many credits and around a decade later that he contributed to something which would remain a culturally significant footnote when he was cast as Harcourt Brown in the science fiction serial Pathfinders to Mars. The director was Guy Verney. He was a family friend and frequent visitor to our house in my teens, and I visited the set in Teddington during production, recalls George's son, also George, who had been born in 1937. I was fascinated to see George in a spacesuit on board a spaceship. I think their friendship had something to do with the offer of the part to George, who had no previous experience of science fiction roles. As mentioned earlier, Harcourt Brown was introduced as a mysterious character, one who proves to be untrustworthy and a crotchety eccentric, manipulating the more traditional heroic types in the serial and its follow-up, Pathfinders to Venus. It's possible to see elements of the character that might have appealed to producer Sidney Newman, and been employed by him in his next big science fiction venture. George's other TV roles are too many to adequately catalogue here, so let's confine ourselves to genre: Danger Man in 1960, R3 in 1964, The Prisoner episode Checkmate in 1967, and culturally enduring, the Hancock's Half-Hour episode The Missing Page, 1960. While his credits in the medium are too many to list, his frustrations in regard to working in it are worth quoting. "Television has wrecked acting because it's impossible to make a stirring success. I'm never in line for an ordinary part, an English barrister, say, with some sensible lines to deliver. Some silly bastard always says, 'Coulouris, he's a foreigner, isn't he?'" Despite such dissatisfaction, his movie career continued too, if not at quite the same level as his Hollywood years. Though Nicholas Ray's King of Kings, 1961, Papillon, 1973, and the all-star Murder on the Orient Express with Albert Finney, 1974, weren't too shabby engagements-wise. But he was a very regular face and a well-known name. That name still finds its way onto cast lists for The Long Good Friday, even though his role, Gus, ended up on the cutting room floor. But he was still working into his 80s. His Greek roots came in useful towards the end of his career. He was in an episode of Jemima Shaw Investigates, a Greek bearing gifts, in 1983, as well as a heart-to-heart set on the island of Rhodes. The location filming in Greece itself prompted his second wife, Elizabeth, Louise had died in 1976, to persuade him to use the opportunity to discover if he still had relatives there. And to their delight, a number of cousins were uncovered, enabling him to bring some aspects of his heritage full circle towards the end of his life. His final role was Italian General Emilio de Bono in the epic miniseries Mussolini, The Untold Story, starring George C. Scott, in 1985. But he had to give up his career due to the onset of Parkinson's disease, and although debilitated by it, he still determinedly dictated his thoughts and memories in an attempt to put together an autobiography. His death from heart failure in Hampstead, London, in April 1989 made the news on both sides of the Atlantic, including an obituary in the New York Times, whilst the UK's Daily Telegraph described him as a ubiquitous, if underrated, character actor of considerable presence, whose somewhat sinister features tended to be more familiar than his frequently misspelt name. Most of his obituaries pointed out his propensity to get cast as the villain. His heavy frown and menacing manner were invaluable in Hollywood or Hammer horrors, said The Independent. "I don't think he thought of himself as someone who only worked as a villain," observed his wife Elizabeth, "but I don't think he minded. He enjoyed it because he did it well." Over the years, he listed his favourite stage roles as Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear, and towards the end of his career, he was still unimpressed by the dazzle of Hollywood. "All they can offer you is a big lump of money and a load of trash," he said. His son, George F. Coulouris, is a retired British computer scientist and emeritus professor of Queen Mary, University of London. George and Louise's other child, a daughter, Mary Louise Coulouris, died in 2011. She was an acclaimed painter, printmaker, muralist and public artist whose works appear in galleries and museums, railway stations, hospitals and private collections in the UK and beyond. "Even Orson Welles couldn't displace my father as the most colourful person in my life," remembered George Coulouris, and it was perhaps his Greek ancestry that was responsible for his most prominent characteristic, his strong sense of drama, both on the stage and off it. He is the subject of a book, The Unholy Three, Screen Villains and English Gentlemen by John Hamilton, the titular triumvirate of Coulouris, André Morel and Dennis Price, and there is much more detail than even too much information can handle at the website coulouris.net, which has photographs, cuttings, and even an archive interview with our subject. On his 100th birthday, Appointment with Venus was shown at the Corner House Cinema in Manchester. William Russell was in attendance, as were George's family. There was a special exhibition about his life and work at the Salford Museum and Art Gallery in 2005. From humble beginnings, George Coulouris played golf with Olivier in Beverly Hills, and he dined once with President Roosevelt, and he shared the screen with a number of the greats. He also gets a mention in the Doctor Who audio adventure Invaders from Mars, set during the making of Wells's War of the Worlds, which Coulouris wasn't actually in, but it doesn't matter because it's a nice nod and he might have been around. John Houseman has the line, "Coulouris, what are you doing with those keys?" which means he has the pleasing distinction of being an actor who has played a role in a Doctor Who story and featured as a character in another. It pales into insignificance to some of the major achievements of this busy and capable thespian, but hey, that's an actor's life. Talking of which, reflecting at the end of his life, George said he had no time for the usual crap written by actors about their 99 careers. "I now realise what a miserable business I've been in for over 60 years. A business where I can't remember telling the truth about a job, a part in a film or play, when I was interviewed, too frightened of not getting it, and later on, to protect my growing bank balance, I listened to variegated morons give their opinions of plays which I knew to be asininely stupid and pretentious." He remained then, never one to mince his words nor curry favour. One can only imagine what he thought of the Keys of Marinus. George's son George has been extremely helpful, providing too much information with a wealth of material for this episode, so it's only fitting that the last word on George should come from him. George's career commitment was to drama and to playing interesting parts in any dramatic medium. This commitment guided his life and career from UK repertory theatre to Broadway and Hollywood. George was fortunate to land his first major film role in Citizen Kane. Many people would regard the Hollywood career that followed as their life's goal, but not George. His love for stage performances and the English way of life brought him back to the UK. George had many of the characteristics one would expect in an actor, though not at the expense of a very intense interest in the wider world, from politics and sport to a 40-year family life in his Hampstead home. Gordon Wales. George Coulouris isn't the only person whose sole name check in the credits for Doctor Who comes at the end of the Sea of Death. This is also the only time that Gordon Wales is featured on an episode of Doctor Who. The Vord return in episode 6, but he doesn't, nor is he used to play different roles throughout the serial, like a kind of theatrical rep performer, in the same way that his compadres Peter Stenson and Martin Court are. So, what can we find out about this one-week visitor to the Whoniverse, who only has 3 other credits on IMDb? Well, he was born in 1929 to an English father and a Scottish mother, and grew up in the Canadian prairies, enduring enormous hardship during the Great Depression. Despite a poverty-stricken upbringing, he was able to fulfill his dream of working on stage in the early 1950s and was a member of the Royal Winnipeg Ballet Company. By 1956, he was in Britain, swelling the crowds in Wonderful Town at the Prince's, now Shaftesbury, Theatre on Shaftesbury Avenue, and then in the musical comedy Grab Me a Gondola at the Lyric Hammersmith, which ran for 2 years. He also did some choreography for the touring version. Then it was on to Candide at the Saville in 1959, and by 1961 he was appearing in a lead role, Bernardo of the Sharks, in West Side Story, directed by Jerome Robbins himself, no less. According to the Manchester Evening News, he was outstanding in the show, which toured before hitting Edinburgh, and he was there giving a fine performance, according to the Scotsman, in 1962, the same year that found him choreographing and performing in Revue in Guildford. In 1963, he was in The Boys from Syracuse at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane with Bob Monkhouse and Dennis Quilley. He was also making inroads into television, usually as a dancer on revue-based shows like Kindly Leave the Stage and Millie, before he donned his rubber for the stint on Marinus. He was offered the chance to tour in A Funny Thing Happened on the way to the Forum, but turned down the opportunity, as he was ambivalent about working in apartheid-ridden South Africa. A friend told him he was mad to miss this opportunity, especially as it would enable him to see what was going on in South Africa for himself, and the acting union Equity encouraged him to take the offer up and to report back about his experiences. This would be useful intel. Equity was divided about what its approach to the country should be, something that caused real divisions for a time. He fell in love with the country the moment he stepped off the plane, and having been hired for the show for 6 months, he ended up staying for 13 years. He started pottery as a hobby when recovering from a back injury incurred during a theatrical endeavour, and gradually it became his profession. He formed the Pottery Association of Southern Africa and taught art from his studio. He remained unhappy with the politics of South Africa, though, and so scouted Canada to see if it was possible to earn a living there, and happened upon a gap in the market. He found it to be dominated by brown pieces, so he decided to specialise in white pottery, and retailers were delighted. Having relocated to a new continent then, he opened a pottery studio, Flagstone Gallery, so named because his property included part of a quarry among its land, on Salt Spring Island, British Columbia, and became rather well known in his field. The house is now a bed and breakfast called Quarrystone House. The gallery room that visitors can stay in to this day is named after Gordon's studio and gallery. When he moved from there, he relocated to Vancouver Island. And that's where the trail ends. Too much information, can't find anything about Gordon beyond 2020. Are he and his wife Janet out there? Well, if so, Gordon would be in his mid-90s, but that's no reason to give up. And I have contacted the family members that I think I've traced. But if there's anyone out there who has a friendly old thesp living next door, whose eyes light up with a reawakened memory at the sight of flippers, well, as we know, in these circumstances, one can never have too much information. As for Gordon himself, his philosophy on life paints an interesting picture. I'm quoting here from an interview with him that I found. "We can all do things to change the ways of the world," he said in 1992, when turning part of his land into a wildflower meadow and hoping to build an amphitheatre to enable people to enjoy theatre, music, and the great outdoors on his property. "Even if we just make a garden that makes someone happy." And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. It's an episode that pounces on the slightly greater freedom provided by the success of the Daleks to take the show about as far from its founding Reithian principles as it'll ever achieve over the course of its first season. This is pure matinee adventure serial stuff, drawn from the same inspirational font that George Lucas and Steven Spielberg would later literally tap for their Indiana Jones movies. Our heroes dash from peril to peril, set piece to set piece, with a breathlessness that does double duty in keeping us thrilled whilst earnestly trying to distract us from the fact that the plot is only slightly thicker than your average garden variety facial tissue. From acid pool to glass submersible to dead body, or more precisely, to an absence of dead body. From strange rubber-suited interloper to booby-trapped pyramid to mysterious monk, the Sea of Death is never short of invention, and it tries for as much spectacle as can be mustered on a BBC budget and a desperately short lead time for production. Sure, the improbably deep shaft that drops Vord 2 to his demise is a lot less visually impressive than that famous granite sphere that chases Harrison Ford's intrepid archaeologist in Raiders of the Lost Ark, but it's still indicative of an episode that's determined to offer the viewer one frisson of surprise after another, and one that won't let up until the credits roll. And even amidst all the daring-do, Terry Nation still makes room for a thought-provoking science fiction concept, even if the boy's own adventure format of the Keys of Marinus won't give him much scope to explore it. There's clearly a whole backstory that remains mostly unsaid about the conscience of Marinus. Indeed, the 4-page storyline delves more deeply into the subject than the scripts ever do, but we learn enough to give us pause for thought. On the surface, the script seems to blithely accept that the conscience, a machine that can do away with evil thoughts, is inherently a good thing. And yet it immediately provides us with a counterexample. Not only have the Vord upended the society of Marinus through their resistance to the conscience's influence, but they pose an existential threat by giving rise to the possibility that the same machine could be put to evil ends. Mind control even in the name of utopian ideals, is a risky business. A case, perhaps, of the ends failing to justify the means. And it leaves you wondering just what is up with the Vord anyway. Sure, there's no denying that the trio we meet in the Sea of Death are out-and-out villains, what with all the knife-wielding skullduggery and murder, but are they necessarily representative of the Vord as a whole? This might be the bad lot that often seems to attach themselves to a political movement, taking advantage of the situation for their own nefarious ends. Maybe the majority of the Vord just got fed up with having their minds messed around with by Marinus's equivalent of ChatGPT. Let's face it, any group that thinks that a priority for their fetish gear is to advertise their favourite geometrical shapes on their bonds can't be all that bad, can they? Oh, and what you mean is that all visitors are unwelcome. Doctor Who, The Sea of Death. Featured Martin Court, Peter Stenson and Gordon Wales as the Vords. The title music was by Ron Grainer with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The incidental music was by Norman Kay. The story editor was David Whittaker. The designer, Raymond P. Cusick. And the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, it's episode 2 of The Keys of Marinus, but in some ways it's also a brand new adventure, as we dispense with any thoughts of the creepy rubber-suited Vord in favour of the no less creepy and only slightly less rubbery brains of Morphoton. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Velvet Web, or I'm not usually attracted to a brain in a jar, but I know one in Morphoton that's a real looker. Too Much Information, The Sea of Death, was presented by me, Toby Haydock, from a script that I co-wrote with Shannon Patrick Sullivan. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone and Shirley Houston, and this was made with thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, Kral Thal, Alex Moore, Stephen Shapansky, Peter Ware, and special thanks to George F. Coulouris. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, one per story as opposed to per episode, far too much information that is for now exclusive to patrons, who also qualify for bonus material, early releases and other exclusives, as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also nearly 6 months ahead with my Happy Times and Places podcast, so if you want to hear video maker from the other side of the world, Kieran Hyman, roll the dice on the Celestial Toy Maker, or magazine editor and book writer Graham Kibble-White stay up all night with Sleep No More, then head to patreon.com/Toby Haydock. References. Too Much Information would, of course, contain far too little information if it weren't for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that has been unearthed and collected over the years. My debt to those responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. The production subtitles on BBC Video's DVD of The Keys of Marinus, written by Richard Molesworth, are a treasure trove of insight and information. The earliest days of Doctor Who are chronicled by a small library of splendid reference works, from Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who The Early Years to the titanic tag team of Doctor Who The 60s and Doctor Who The Handbook The First Doctor by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, and culminating in Doctor Who The Complete History Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. The Complete History boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Ainsworth and Alistair McGowan, and Mark Wright is co-editor as well, and of course it builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for The Keys of Marinus can be found in issue 310, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also, a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is the Fact of Fiction, for which Jonathan Morris studied The Keys of Marinus in issue 445. And a discussion of relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement of that premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 28 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time, open brackets, travel, close brackets. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of the Keys of Marinus, although this one is rather more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. And finally, if you want to know more about the fascinating George Coulouris, then visit the aforementioned coulouris.net, which has been lovingly curated by George's son. I walk in the shadows of giants. Giants who are probably less interested in smelling the blood of an Englishman than in thoroughly scrutinising his curriculum vitae. And thanks are due to the many patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Lee Wood, Stephen Witowski, Mr. Withit, Chris Williams, David James Wilson, Rich Wiggins, Kevin West, Peter Ware, Gavin Ware, Craig Wallace, Alistair Wallace, Steve Walker, Jeff Walker, Gary Wales, Lee Wakerley, John Turner, Fanman Sang, Jim Trenowden, Sidney Truitt, David Trainier, Sabrina Tirabassi, Jason Thompson, Richard Thomas, Dr. Gary Thomas, Mark Swan, Chris Stokes, David Spofforth, Joey Stephen, Matthew Speddings, David Spencer, Andrew Snedden, Richard Smith, Trevor Smith, Giles Smith, David Smith, Dale Smith, Darcy Smart, Gavin Skinner, Scott Sherritt, John Sheehan, Christopher Sharp, Frank Shales, Samuel, I have no surname for you, Samuel, Edward Salt, Nick Salmond, Tom Selinsky, Gavin Rymil, John Rumfit, Darren Rule, Ronin, that's Tom, and Stephen Moffat and Ruben Herfindahl. And would you like your name read out on the credits? Well, that's one of the many bonuses of being a patron of these endeavours. Find out more at patreon.com/Toby Haydoke. There, for as little as £3 a month, you are able to get advance releases, bonus material, pictures of my dog. You'd have got this particular podcast a couple of months early. The Happy Times and Places podcasts are about 6 months earlier. And you also get behind-the-scenes snoops at any sort of DVD documentaries I might have done or events, interviews with Doctor Who personnel, and all sorts of other goodies, as well as the most popular corner of my Patreon, which is pictures of my dog. Well, he's a very nice chap. So that's patreon.com/Toby Haydoke, where you get a 10% discount if you sign up for a year in one go. There are other ways of supporting without having to commit to monthly payments. You can go to kofi.com/Toby Haydoke and give a one-off donation anytime something's particularly tickled your fancy. Or if you want to do the bit that doesn't cost anything, that's absolutely fine. I'm just grateful you've listened. In fact, I'm even more grateful if you're listening this far in, because, the fun's over. If there was any fun. The scrutiny is over. The pedantry is over. The dissection of minutiae is over. This is just the begging bowl bit. But look, you don't need to put anything of any worth to you that costs you anything into my metaphorical bowl. All you have to do is go to iTunes, Apple, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere that you digest these things, and give them a 5-star review and perhaps a few lines of description about what it is you like about them, and recommend them to other people, because that really helps to separate these from the crowd. And there are quite a few Doctor Who podcasts out there. I don't know if you've noticed. So any support via the medium of cyberspace is much appreciated. I'm on Twitter at Toby Haydoke. These podcasts have their own feed at Haydoke Podcasts, and I have a Facebook page, and I'm on Instagram at Toby.Haydoke. So if you haven't had enough of me already, for having just listened to me forever, then there's more. Now go. I'll wave you off like Arbitan, and as soon as you go, I'll be unceremoniously stabbed in the back and then clutch my chest. Bye.